In the fall of 1991, every apple grower in Cass County, Missouri, ripped out their old orchards and planted Gala. Every grower except one. Martha Engstrom kept her winesaps, and her Jonathans, and her Pippins, and her Russets, and her Northern Spies, and the 3 trees of an apple that had no name at all, just a handwritten tag wired to the trunk that said Grandma Lena's, 1923. The Engstrom orchard covered 28 acres on a south-facing hillside above the Marais des Cygnes River. It had been planted by Martha's grandfather, August Engstrom, in 1919, when he came home from the First World War, with mustard gas scars on his lungs, and a belief that the best thing a man could do with his life was grow something beautiful. August had planted 14 varieties of apple, not because the market wanted 14 varieties, the market wanted 1 or 2, but because August believed that an orchard should be like a family, different trees with different strengths, covering for each other's weaknesses, so that no single disease, no single frost, no single drought could take them all. By 1991, the market had changed. Supermarkets wanted uniformity. They wanted apples that were the same size, the same color, the same shape, the same flavor. They wanted Gala sweet, mild, red, perfect for photographs, perfect for displays, perfect for a consumer who wanted an apple that looked like it had been designed by a committee. The Gala revolution swept through Missouri like a fever. Growers pulled out their old trees that had been producing for 40, 50, 60 years, and planted Gala on dwarfing rootstock that would fruit in 3 years and could be harvested by machine and packed by robot and shipped 3,000 miles without a bruise. The extension agent, a man named Bradley Cross, who had a master's in pomology from the University of Missouri, came to Martha's farm in March of 1991 with a briefcase full of charts and projections. "Mrs. Engstrom," he said, "the market data is clear. Gala is the future. It accounts for 23% of all apple sales in the U.S. and growing. Winesap accounts for less than 1%. Jonathan is at 2%. The varieties in your orchard are, frankly, obsolete. I'd strongly recommend." Martha cut him off. She was 52 years old, small, wiry, with hands calloused from 30 years of pruning, and a voice that could stop a tractor at 50 yards. "Mr. Cross," she said, "my grandfather planted these trees. My mother grafted that tree over there when she was pregnant with me. I ate my first apple from that Jonathan when I was 3 years old, and I can still taste it. You want me to cut them all down and plant a variety that tastes like wet cardboard because a supermarket in New Jersey says so?" "Mrs. Engstrom, the market. The market is wrong," Martha said. "And when the market is wrong, the people who followed the market are the ones who pay." Bradley wrote something on his clipboard and drove away. He told his colleagues at the extension office that Martha Engstrom was stubborn, sentimental, and economically irrational. He was right about the first 2. For 15 years, it looked like he was right about the third. The Gala growers thrived: supermarket contracts, guaranteed prices, volume discounts. The big operations 200-acre, 500-acre orchards planted in uniform rows of identical Gala trees were making money, good money. The kind of money that bought new trucks and new houses and vacations to places that apple farmers in Missouri had never been. Martha sold her apples at the farmers market in Harrisonville. Every Saturday from September to November, she loaded her truck with wooden crates of winesaps and Jonathans and Pippins and Russets and the apples with no name that tasted like honey and smoke and something else that nobody could identify but everybody wanted more of. She made enough to keep the orchard going, not enough to get rich, not enough to replace equipment, not enough to hire help. She did the pruning herself, every tree, every year. In February, when the branches were bare and the wind cut through her jacket like a knife, and her hands ached from squeezing the pruning shears for 8 hours a day, She did the spraying herself, a 200-gallon tank on a trailer behind her tractor, hand-pumping the pressure because the motor had died in 1998 and she couldn't afford to replace it. She mixed her own spray, kaolin clay, and neem oil and fish emulsion because she'd stopped using synthetic fungicides in 1995 after reading a Rachel Carson essay that August's daughter had left in the farmhouse when she died. She did the picking herself, with occasional help from her daughter June, who was a school teacher in Butler and came on weekends when she could. June would drive the 45 minutes each way on Saturday morning, pick apples until her shoulders burned, eat lunch at the kitchen table, pick until dark, drive home, and do it again the next day. June never complained. She understood that the orchard was not a business to her mother. It was a promise. August had planted those trees, and August's daughter had grafted more trees, and Martha had maintained every one of them. And the promise was that the trees would outlast them all. The neighbors felt sorry for her. Poor Martha, stubborn Martha, sitting on 28 acres of antique trees while the rest of the world moved on. Jim Barker, the biggest apple grower in the county, invited Martha to dinner once in 2002. He was trying to be kind. Over pot roast and green beans, he offered to buy her orchard for $3,500 per acre, $98,000 total, and convert it to Gala. Martha put down her fork. "Jim," she said, "my grandfather planted those trees the year he came home from the war. He had mustard gas scars on his lungs, and he couldn't breathe right for the rest of his life. He planted apple trees because he said they were the most hopeful thing a man could grow. You plant a tree knowing you won't eat from it for 5 years, and you do it anyway because you believe there will be a future worth eating apples in." She picked up her fork. "I'm not selling that for $98,000. I'm not selling it for $98 million. Jim never asked again. Then bitter rot came. Coletotrichum gloeosporioides, a fungal pathogen that attacks apple fruit during warm, humid weather. It had always been present in Missouri, but it was manageable, a nuisance, not a crisis. Until 2006. The summer of 2006 was the wettest in 40 years. June rainfall was 300% above normal. July was worse. The humidity was oppressive, the kind of sticky, suffocating wetness that makes cotton stick to your skin and bread mold overnight, and fungi explode with the enthusiasm of organisms that have been waiting their whole lives for exactly this moment. The first signs appeared in late June, small brown spots on the fruit, circular, slightly sunken, expanding by the day. The spots were soft to the touch. Press your thumb on one and it would sink in like rotten wood, and a thin film of salmon-colored spores would ooze from the surface. By mid-July, the spots were everywhere, on every Gala tree in the county. The disease spread fastest in monoculture plantings orchards, where every tree was the same variety, the same age, the same rootstock, planted 6 feet apart in rows that trapped moisture and blocked air circulation. The Gala variety, it turned out, was particularly susceptible. Its thin skin and high sugar content were perfect for the fungus. The fruit rotted on the tree, turning brown and soft and dropping to the ground where the spores multiplied and reinfected the trees above. The growers sprayed and sprayed and sprayed. Captan, Mancozeb, Topsin-M, every fungicide in the arsenal. The chemical smell hung over the orchards like a fog, thick and acrid, burning the eyes and the throat. Some growers were spraying every 3 days by August, spending more on fungicide than they would make on the fruit. The standard fungicide program, the one that had worked for years, couldn't keep up. The interval between sprays was designed for normal weather. 2006 was not normal. Growers who sprayed every 14 days lost 30% of their crop. Growers who sprayed every 7 days lost 15%. Nobody sprayed every 3 days because nobody could afford to. Jim Barker, the biggest Gala grower in Cass County, 240 acres, all Gala, all dwarfing rootstock, lost 45% of his crop. That's $540,000 in fruit, rotting in the orchard. Tom Hensley lost 38%. Dave McCord lost 42%. The county average loss was 35%. Martha Engstrom lost 8%. 8%. On an orchard with 14 varieties, some planted in 1919, none of them Gala, none of them on dwarfing rootstock, all of them spaced far enough apart that air could move through the canopy and dry the leaves and starve the fungus. Let me explain why Martha's losses were so low, because the science behind it is the vindication of everything August Engstrom believed when he planted 14 varieties instead of one. The winesaps lost almost nothing. The variety was naturally resistant to Calototricum. Thick skin, low sugar, a natural wax layer that the fungus couldn't penetrate easily. The winesap had been growing in American orchards since at least the 1700s. It had co-evolved with every disease and pest that the climate could produce. It wasn't immune, no apple is immune to everything, but it was tough in the way that old things are tough, built to survive rather than to look good in a photograph. The Jonathans lost some maybe 12%. But the Jonathans were on the west side of the orchard, where the afternoon breeze came up from the river, and the air movement kept the moisture down. The spacing helped too. August had planted his trees 25 feet apart, which was considered wasteful in 1919 and was considered insane by 1991, when Gala growers were planting 6 feet apart on dwarfing rootstock. But 5-foot spacing meant air. Air meant dry leaves. Dry leaves meant no fungus. The pippins were untouched. The russets were untouched. The northern spy showed zero infection. It ripened in November, well after the humid weather had passed. And Grandma Lena's apples were untouched. Whatever that unnamed variety was, it had been growing on this hillside for 83 years and had developed its own relationship with every fungus, every insect, every weather pattern that the hill produced. It had survived the wet summer of 1937 and the humid fall of 1958 without human intervention, without fungicide, without anything except its own genetics and the space that August had given it. August Engstrom's philosophy, different trees with different strengths, covering for each other's weaknesses, had proven itself in exactly the way he'd predicted 87 years earlier. An orchard should be like a family. If one member is weak, the others carry the weight. The strength is not in any individual tree. The strength is in the diversity. Jim Barker lost 45%, $540,000 in fruit, rotting on the trees. Tom Hensley lost 38%. Dave McCord lost 42%. The county average loss was 35%. The total loss across Cass County was estimated at $2.1 million, $2,100,000 in apple revenue, destroyed by a fungus that fed on uniformity. Jim Barker drove to Martha's farm in October of 2006. He sat in his truck for 10 minutes before he got out. His wife later told June that Jim had been crying not about the money, but about the trees, his grandfather's trees. The winesaps and Baldwins he'd pulled out in 1991 because a man with a clipboard said they were obsolete. When he knocked on Martha's door, his hands were shaking. "Martha, do you have scions I could graft?" Martha looked at him. Jim Barker, who had pulled out his grandfather's orchard in 1991 and planted wall-to-wall Gala. Jim Barker, who had told Martha she was throwing away money on antique trees. Jim Barker, who had laughed not meanly, but he'd laughed when Martha's farmer's market revenue was $42,000 and his supermarket contract was $1.2 million. She could have said no. She could have reminded him of every comment, every headshake, every pitying look. She didn't. She said, "Come with me." They walked into the orchard. Martha showed him the winesaps, 85 years old. Trunks thick as fence posts. Canopies spreading 30 feet across. producing 15 bushels per tree of apples that tasted like cinnamon in cold weather and something you remembered from childhood but couldn't name. She showed him the Northern Spy, a late-season variety that nobody grew anymore, because it took 15 years to come into full production, and the modern market had no patience for anything that took 15 years. She showed him Grandma Lena's trees. 3 trees. Lena Engstrom, August's mother, had brought scions from Germany in 1908, grafted them onto wild rootstock, and planted them on the hillside before August was old enough to hold a pruning saw. "Nobody knows what variety this is," Martha said. "I've sent samples to 3 universities. None of them could match it. It might be an old German variety that went extinct over there. These might be the last 3 trees in the world." Jim looked at the trees. Ancient bark, gnarled branches, fruit that was small, russeted, ugly by supermarket standards. But the flesh was dense and complex, sweet and tart and aromatic, with layers of flavor that changed as you chewed, like a wine that reveals itself in stages. "Martha," Jim said, "these apples are worth more than everything in my orchard combined." Martha smiled. She knew. Martha gave Jim scions. She gave scions to Tom Hensley and Dave McCord and every other grower in the county who asked. She taught them how to graft the old way, the way August had taught her mother and her mother had taught her, with a sharp knife and grafting wax and the patience to wait 3 to 5 years for the first fruit. By 2012, the craft cider industry had arrived in Missouri. Small producers looking for apples with character, not Gala sweetness, but the tannin, the acid, the complexity that fermentation needs to produce something worth drinking. They found Martha. The first cidery to use Martha's apples, a small operation in Kansas City called Westport Cider, won a national competition in 2014 with a blend of winesap, pippin, and Grandma Lena's. The press release called Grandma Lena's a previously unknown heritage variety, with extraordinary complexity, possibly of German origin, preserved for over a century by a single family in Cass County, Missouri. Martha's apples were suddenly famous. Not supermarket famous, better than that. The kind of famous where people drive 2 hours on a Saturday to buy a bag of apples from a woman in overalls who picks them by hand and knows the name and history of every tree in her orchard. Martha's revenue tripled between 2014 and 2018, not because she grew more apples, because the apples she'd been growing for 30 years were finally worth what they'd always been worth. Martha is 84 now. June runs the orchard. June's daughter, August named for her great-great-grandfather, is 12 years old and learning to graft. The winesaps are still producing. The trees are over 100 years old. They're slower now. The trunks are hollow in places. The canopies are thinner. But every September, the fruit comes. Grandma Lena's 3 trees are still alive, still fruiting, still producing apples that nobody can identify and everybody wants. Martha sent scion wood to the USDA germplasm repository in Geneva, New York in 2019. The variety has been preserved. If the 3 trees die, the genetics will survive, but the trees show no signs of dying. They've been growing on that hillside for 116 years. They've survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, a dozen droughts, 100 storms, and 1 extension agent with a clipboard who said they were obsolete. They are not obsolete. They are patient. And patience is the thing the market never has and always needs. August Engstrom planted 14 varieties because he believed an orchard should be like a family. 100 years later, the family is still standing.